All right. There are handouts. Yeah, how do you turn it up? Okay. Maybe Elizabeth is going to turn up the volume. So the Comprehensive Long-Range Plan Committee has been meeting since June of 2016. The Select Board charged the committee to work with the Planning Department staff, as well as other boards and committees in town, and the public to develop the Comprehensive Long-Range Plan. This plan will shape the vision, goals, and strategies. So the Comprehensive Long-Range Plan will shape the vision, goals, and strategies for the town's decision-making framework in the coming decade. And it's the intention of this plan to integrate the town's 4 sustainability principles in this framework. So why a comprehensive long-range plan? The Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 41, establishes the requirement for comprehensive plans by municipalities. Concord's last comprehensive plan was issued in 2005. Over 60% of the implementation items in that plan have been completed or in process. So the Envision Concord Bridge to 2030 plan seeks to understand the current and possible future challenges faced by our community and will describe a vision for the future of Concord with an implementation plan. Like the 2005 comprehensive plan, this will be an actionable plan. The draft plan is informed by the planning standards published by the American Planning Association in Sustaining Places, Best Practices for Comprehensive Plans. These are the 6 principles of this plan. There are 2 processes and 2 attributes which together describe a systems approach to comprehensive planning. This approach has enabled a dynamic and participatory process, and the committee anticipates the resulting plan will be better integrated across the traditional plan elements of past comprehensive plans. The Envision Concord planning process has focused on authentic participation and has sought wide and deep participation from members of boards and committees, the town staff, as well as residents and citizens. And we are here tonight to continue this public participation. This draft plan will be refined in the coming months. I want you to know that there is still time to influence the plan, to refine it, and to help us make changes. So, what is a systems approach? The integrated systems approach that's been drafted into the plan is highlighted in the APA principles. With traditional planning methodology, the discrete plan elements such as housing, land use, transportation, economic vitality, and the like are addressed separately. We know that these elements in reality are all part of a complex system that together determine the form and function of our community as a whole. So by applying systems thinking to developing the implementation priorities, this comprehensive plan will account for adaptation to conditions that are outside the control of Concord's government, such as resource availability, local employment base, population growth, and climate change. Including adaptation strategies in the action items of the implementation plan will allow Concord to achieve more results for each of its investments. So I want to give you just a brief example of a traditional planning approach. So if the idea is to create a small playground within a 5-minute walk of every neighborhood in Concord, if that were one of our goals. The bullets show some action items. We might do a GIS study to identify the neighborhoods that do not have playgrounds. We might identify that we need to procure 6 to 10 1/4 acre parcels in all of the underserved parts of town. And then we would perhaps agree to finance purchase of those parcels from taxes or parks and recreation budgets and redevelop them at a cost of, let's say, $1 million apiece. In a systems approach, the idea might be reframed to be multi-use town parcel acquisition that would give us benefits in improved livability, sustainability, economic resilience, and health and equity. And so we might acquire parcels for a similar investment that would allow the town to have playgrounds and perhaps mini-grid distributed storage and control, historic landmark and cultural kiosks to highlight our cultural and historic assets, affordable small houses, public transit hubs or autonomous electric vehicle charging stations. So I think you may see the notion here illustrated that we would get multiple benefits across many sectors in town for a similar investment. So where are we in the process? So this is the schedule we've worked with. It shows you all of the events that this comprehensive long-range plan has been focused on in the last almost 2 years. The public hearing date, the blue arrow shows where we are today. So you can see we're approaching the end of our process. So I want to give you a highlight of what's next. Coming attractions. The draft plan has been available for public comment since March. Tonight is our public hearing. By the end of April, we anticipate we will receive comments from the boards and committees. That means that in May, we will be focused on incorporating comments that we hear from you tonight, as well as input from the boards and committees to develop our implementation actions and refine the plan in May. In June, we will issue a final draft for public comment, and after those comments are incorporated, we will present the final plan to the planning board for adoption, and it will be presented to the select board for acceptance. So now Gary's going to give us a quick overview of the plan before we open the floor for public comment.
Yeah, thanks so much, Elise. Can everybody hear me okay? Marcia, you hear me? Great. So what's in this plan? So this slide illustrates the table of contents for the plan. It's organized into 5 sections. Section 4 includes the traditional plan elements that many of you are familiar with seeing in long-range plans as required by Massachusetts statutes. But it's important to note that what you have seen to date, the draft plan that's out there that Elise referred to, is draft. Obviously, it's incomplete. More work is needed. The implementation action section in Section 5, as Elise alluded to, that's largely the work of May. So it's not too late if there's some action that you think we need to be undertaking. We'll be working on that over the coming months and aligning that with comments we receive from the public and our boards and committees. More work is needed as well as, on syntax and editing. Our consultant is working on beefing up some of the figures and graphics to make it more visually appealing and the narrative and so forth. So you'll see a new plan in the final draft that we release in June, but we'd like to hear your ideas and thoughts about what's missing from the draft framework that we have put out there. So how is it structured? Is that section 2? I went too far, yeah. Section 1 really highlights, I guess I should have been speaking to this slide, which was the table of contents. So it is organized in 5 sections, but section 1 starts with the vision. As our colleague Jim Bryant is fond of pointing out, you can't do strategic planning without a vision. So we started with developing looking at the existing conditions in Concord, demographics, moving on to look at some of the highlights of trends in Concord for the 8 plan elements, and working together as a committee to establish a vision for where we want to see the town of Concord in 2030. Section 2 puts that vision into practice. Using the systems approach, we have established some Concord-specific filters or community lenses through which we look at some of the plan elements. These 5 criteria and the committee identified as being particularly important in Concord: preserving our history and character, respecting the livability of the town relative to our values as Concordians, highlighting mobility and accessibility for everybody, and achieving environmental sustainability consistent with our town's framework, sustainability framework, and looking at fiscal sustainability. Section 3, big ideas. This section is an illustration of the systems planning approach. 3 scenarios are laid out corresponding to opportunities that are described for 3 high-priority sets of goals for Concord, with a number of implementation actions and links to plan elements in Section 4. So Section 4, again, addresses specific goals for each of the categories that are in traditional plan elements. And there's a handout out front that lists all of the goals from this section. Hopefully you got the handout on the way in. But I would point out that while there's some overlap with the big ideas presented in Section 3, the plan elements presented in Section 4 demonstrate how these initiatives, these 3 big ideas, which can span many municipal functions, are supported within the individual areas of town municipal government. Section 5, implementation actions. The draft plan illustrates the systems checklist and element action chart. This section is incomplete in the draft. We've given you a little teaser for where we'd like to go with that last section, but that, again, is the work of May. So we really do want to move on to hear public comment. Before we do that, we just want to give you a taste of what are the kinds of things that we're struggling with as a committee, and that we're hoping to hear from public input from you all as to how we can address some of the goals and competing interests. For example, how we can protect our village center's character and enhance their economic vitality, but what's the town's role in incentivizing or regulating and coordinating public and private sector actions? How do we balance pedestrian, bicycle, and complete street designs, including first mile, last mile transportation to connect with our public transit? Reduce overall traffic congestion? How do we provide for more affordable workforce housing and balance that with the massing, the bulk, and some of the other zoning regulations that we currently have on the books? How do we assure affordability for all, including the increasing needs for emergency financial assistance among some of our fellow Concordians? How do we proactively plan for capital investments in the town and the schools? How do we move boldly to a more sustainable and resilient future? These are the questions that we're trying to address in our look over the past month at the goals. And again, a revised list of goals has been provided as a handout. This is not the same list of goals that you saw in the March 5th draft, because over the month of April, we as a committee have been actively revisiting those goals to see if we can refine them. And as we said, over May, we'll be looking at the implementation actions that go along with those goals. So we're eager to hear from you, what you think about the draft plan, our new goals, any goals that you think need further refinement, as well as what actions or implementation steps you think need to be included in the plan. And now I think I would ask the other members of the Comprehensive Long Range Plan Committee to come up front, join us at these tables up front so that we can all sort of respond to any questions or comments you may have. And I think we would ask that if you have a comment, if you could come down to the microphone here and provide your name and your address for the record. This is being filmed, and then hopefully people at home will be able to follow along with what your question is, and we'll be able to give you a response. So if we can get the committee up front, that would be great.
Both sides. Both sides.
What?
Okay, so we've completed our furniture rearrangement, so we'd love to hear from any of you.
Is that mic on?
Same, right?
This one's on.
There we go.
If anybody has any comments, please come to the mic. I'd love to hear what you think about the long-range plan.
Hi, Lori Gilpazaris, 1376 Old Marlborough Road. Again, I want to congratulate you for seemingly being able to take a very mixed bag of issues and problems and solutions and somehow coming up with something that actually makes some sense. I just wanted to comment once again on strategies to preserve open space and natural resource, and this is under big ideas for integrated planning. I've been very uncomfortable with inclusion of open space and housing, and I think my concern is that perhaps it's not open space and housing that we're talking about, but it's really land use and housing. So the open space that we have that's protected is one thing, and then the land that we have that's still open and could be developed is quite another. But I think it's a tricky line to cross, because when we talk about any land, we really should be thinking about the natural systems that land serves. And so it makes sense that the land is more valuable for the natural systems it supports and the free services it provides to the town than perhaps housing should be considered elsewhere. So I'm hoping that maybe we could move further toward an understanding that we're not really talking about encroaching on nature and open space as much as we are about finding the right land use for open lands. Does that make sense? All right, I'll write it down and send it to you at some point.
So Lori has pointed out one of the fundamental tensions in this master plan and this comprehensive long-range plan. Preserving the open space that we have, maintaining it as the valuable asset that it is to our town. And while we are faced with the realization that there is inadequate housing, especially in the moderate price ranges to meet the needs of residents. And so that, our interest is in framing a plan for the coming decade to deal with both of those important elements of the plan.
Hi, my name is Carlin Reed, and I live at 83 Wits End. I have a question for the two infrastructure people on the panel, from Public Works and from the Light Board. I'm curious on how you see the two infrastructure sections implementing this plan when it's done. I know both sections have been considering this, and I wondered if I could hear, Mr. Pappas, your thoughts, and then Ms. Briggs, your thoughts about how to implement this plan once it's finished.
Well, that's really, is this on? We'll be developing some actions related to Public Works, for instance, but it's really going to be up to the Public Works Director and the Public Works Commission. Not working?
Next, I was
We need to be closer to it.
Okay, is that better? Yeah. Okay. We'll be working, the committee will be working on actions related to Public Works, for instance, but it's really going to be up to the Public Works Director and the Public Works specifically, helped by the Public Works Commission, to come up with actual operating plans in detail for how it's going to be done. Our role in the committee is really to explain, to articulate where they should be going, not how they're going to get there. Does that answer your question? Yes.
That's a great question, and I know you've attended all of our meetings recently, probably more than me. So the Light Board has some very actionable items which are related to this plan, including the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the movement of our power purchases to non-carbon sources, which, just to be honest, may include nuclear, and also include credits for, to meet the non-carbon purchase. We are moving more aggressively than we did according to Article 51, which wasn't this past town meeting, it was the year before, to make our purchases non-carbon, so that we can then urge our customers, our electric purchasing customers, to move toward non-carbon energy sources for transportation and heating. But first, we need to make sure that we're non-carbon. Then we would like to encourage our customers to purchase more electricity rather than less, which is a very significant paradigm shift, honestly. We've always been having people buy less electricity, and we sold a lot less electricity, but we're trying to shift that around once it's non-carbon emitting. So we have a sort of a separate set of plans and strategic plans, and which are very consistent with the overall plan that we're talking about tonight.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Alicia Hesse-Cleary, and I'm from 77 Wood Street. I have a question about two things. I have two questions. One regards the formula business bylaw. I'd like to get somebody to help explain what that is, if you can. And the other one is, I love these plans here that are proposed, these goals 1 under plan elements, land use zoning. It's so important that we look at our available open space, and we look at our landscapes, and we look at alternative types of housing and mixed-use housing. It's all great, but to me the question is how, and Bedford did a great thing. It's called a fiscal impact. Sorry?
A little closer.
Oh, sorry. Bedford did something in their planning department called a fiscal impact analysis. And what that did was they first analyzed all of the housing stock. So they went through their assessor's database, and they analyzed all the housing stock, literally by square footage, type of housing. And then from there, they were looking at who was coming into the school system. So they look at their demographics. And from there, they can build this model. A lot of towns have done it. And it's a customized model for each town, and there are a couple other inputs that you put into it. But what you can do then is that you can actually keep on tweaking this model as your demographics are changing, as your land inputs are changing. And when you get real estate proposals that come to town, you can then make a very statistically, financially responsible assessment of, do you need this project? Are we just having 5 more of these that we don't need to fill? Are you filling the need? And it's something I think you should look at. The Bedford Town Planning Department, I'm sure they can tell you all about it, and a lot of towns in Massachusetts have done it. So that was just one suggestion, and just going back, if you could explain a little bit behind what the formula business bylaw is. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that one since I was involved with the West Concord Advisory Committee, the West Concord Task Force before that actually helped pass at the 2011 town meeting the formula business bylaw that Town of Concord already has in place. Right now, the formula business bylaw that was passed in 2011 applies only to the village center of West Concord. And right now we have a formula business bylaw with CAP. Basically, it's basically a formula business is defined as any retail establishment that uses similar signage or marketing or basically a formulaic nature for their business operations as 15 other establishments. And so there's a cap right now in West Concord Village of no more than 10 formula businesses are allowed as uses in that business district. And that has been, I think, successful in its objective of keeping the mix of formula and non-formula independent businesses that are in the West Concord Village district. So one of the things we're looking at in this town plan is how do we preserve the rich historic town character that Concord has, both in Concord Center, the Thoreau Depot District, Old Road to 9 Acre Corner, I guess the 9 Acre Corner Commercial District. Those are all business districts that don't have that. And so the question has come up as to whether or not there might be strategies, either fiscal incentives or tax breaks or something that we could do that might encourage the remaining independent businesses to remain, or perhaps discourage formula businesses from locating in our business districts in order to preserve the mix that we have now. So whether it be a formula business bylaw or some other remedy, we're looking at that now, and we welcome people's comments on that, but that's sort of what a formula business bylaw is, and the reason that you implement it is basically to preserve a set of characteristics that you may have that you find desirable in your town centers. On the land use, one of the other goals that we've been discussing, and I think you'll see it in the goal now in the land use goals that we have reflected here, is to think more deliberately about our zoning, which right now tends to be more geographically focused. If you're in zone A or zone AA, one set of rules applies. If you're in a business district, a different set of rules applies. And we're thinking about whether or not the town wants to move to some alternative way of thinking more about the characteristics of the land. Some pieces of land may be highly prized for their agricultural value. Other pieces of land may be adjacent to wetlands and may have tremendous benefit and value for resilience goals. Other parcels of land may be located right in village center with access to goods and services and access to public transit and may be appropriate for housing. So the idea is whether or not we want to think more deliberately about our zoning in terms of the characteristics of land rather than just sort of geographic divisions and zoning that way. We haven't come to formal decisions yet, but we have some goals that we've outlined now to think around that. And I think to your last example, the Bedford example might be a very good one for us. We're also thinking very hard about fiscal sustainability and what is the fiscal impact of continually acquiring new parcels for either open space or resilience purposes, because we know they're not necessarily the same thing, Lori. But as we continue to acquire new parcels of land, we do have to think about the fiscal impacts. And one of the things we're recommending in this plan is and it comes from our fiscal sustainability lens, our Concord, perspective, that this is an important value to us to think more deliberately about the fiscal impact of decisions we make, is to perhaps shift to a longer-term financial planning methodology. And maybe instead of just the sort of 5-year illustrations we've been developing, we'd like to, in this plan, and we're trying hard to pull it together by June, do a 10 or 12-year fiscal illustration of what 2.5% versus 3.5% versus 4.5% budget increases means for people's tax bills, and what it means for town departments and their ability to undertake capital improvements, in whether that's land acquisition or school buildings or other areas of spending. So we're looking at all those areas, but we have a lot more work to do in May.
Bob Andrews, picking up on the formula business part of what you were talking about. I'm one of the, I think, more than 200 people at this point who have signed an online petition calling upon the Long Range Planning Committee to recommend in the plan a new bylaw that would put a cap on formula businesses in all of Concord's business centers. I personally feel strongly that the presence of the existing bylaw in West Concord provides a great model of the benefits of lending our support to local independent businesses. I mean, these businesses are a vital and highly valued part of Concord's unique culture because they're attuned to what people in this community need, want, and enjoy. They build community and help prevent us from becoming more and more isolated from one another. Big businesses with a formula for their stores can easily afford to crowd out the businesses that we love and respect. The time to prevent this is now, not after an unnecessary further study of the business centers.
Thanks for the comment. I just wanted to make one follow-up on this idea of formula businesses. I think one of the things you'll see in the draft plan is that we've been able, through all the input, to identify several values that are broadly held in this community. Some of the art of the plan itself is going to be figuring out how do we sustain those values. And Gary used an important word a minute ago. He said we're going to try to encourage people. I'd like to see us, to the greatest extent possible, provide encouragement, incentives to people to do the things that allow us to achieve these values, as opposed to require things. Because, Bob, I agree with your point. We all cherish the independent retailers, absolutely. But we have to be careful to balance this value or this interest we have around preservation of the independent businesses with the rights of the property owners, right? So they're the ones who bear the cost in many ways. So to the extent that we can encourage, put programs in place that help retain those businesses that we value so much, that make our town center so special, we should try to do that to the greatest extent possible without putting a financial cost on the property owners. So I think striking a balance between encouragement and requirement is going to be important.
I'm Sue Redberg. I live at 103 Revolutionary Road. I'm sorry.
Right into the microphone.
Right into it. Okay. I'll start over. Sue Redberg, 103 Revolutionary Road. Mr. Andrews just stole some of my thunder, but I'm going to repeat myself just to make my point. I'm speaking in support of including a formula business bylaw with caps in the draft plan. The language has been changed to leave that out as an explicit statement, and I would like to see that restored. I served for 10 years on the Historic Districts Commission. It was a challenge to work with other volunteers and townspeople to help the town grow and change, while at the same time trying to preserve the special appearance that makes Concord such a desirable place to live. It has often been said that Concord Center is protected because it is in a historic district. This is only partly true. The HDC is not all-powerful, in spite of what many think, and does not cover all the commercial centers of Concord. It is further limited by its focus on, quote, what can be seen from a public way. While this includes signage and shop fronts and some landscaping, it does not have any authority over what kind of shops or banks or offices may occupy the buildings. However, it was just this function that allowed the HTC to deny Citibank because, unlike other businesses in Concord Center, it would have been entirely lit both day and night. What would have been visible from a public way was everything. Now, Citibank has withdrawn its consumer activities from Massachusetts, and the town would have been left with an empty storefront and a lengthy lease. A cap on formula businesses would help support the Historic Districts Commission in its work to preserve the sense of Concord. We are often reminded that chain stores contribute to the tax base, which gives the false impression that taxes on residents may be lowered if there are enough businesses to carry the tax burden. In actual fact, this doesn't happen. Many businesses are given tax incentives to open in certain locations. The proceeds from these businesses are sent to corporate headquarters, and rarely is any connection made with the town, aside from it being a source of income. Once formula businesses get a foothold in Concord Center, the floodgates will appear to have opened for landlords. It is reasonable for them to want their properties to be rented, but their ability to pay higher rents drives up the rents on surrounding properties. This forces business owners with little flexibility out of business. The experience of the formula business cap in West Concord has brought a swelling of new businesses to that center. Without the threat of chain stores with long leases threatening the area, new businesses have blossomed and are thriving. In closing, I would like to mention that there has already been a study done in West Concord on chain stores and formula businesses. With some alterations, this existing study could be adapted to the other commercial centers. The very best thing would be to act as quickly as possible to put our ducks in a row and get such a bylaw in the warrant for the town meeting of 2019. The draft plan is the first step in the right direction. And I have here a copy of the signatures of the people who have signed a petition supporting this.
Thank you. So I would, we're very appreciative of the comments and the interest regarding formula business bylaws. But I want to be clear that the comprehensive long-range plan will not be drafting a formula business bylaw. That is the work of the planning board. And so the plan may recommend a formula business bylaw as one of several options, but it will be up to the planning board to draft that bylaw, to get it on the warrant in 2019. But thank you for the signatures and for your clear comments. It's very appreciative.
Thank you. So Garrett Whitney, East Bridge Road. Sorry, bending over for these is not so fun. Okay, so we heard in the introductions a number of references to systems thinking and systems planning, which is wonderful, and I want to thank everybody here for all the, I can't believe the work that you guys did. I could never do that amount, ever. So thank you. It's not working?
Right.
Even closer? Okay. All right, thank you. So thank you all is basically what I want to say. As to systems thinking, you probably know, I know Gary does, probably the rest of you do too, that one of the great founders of systems thinking lived in Concord until a couple of years ago, right in Conantum, near where I live, Jay Forrester from MIT. He was the person who was the computer person behind the Limits to Growth book and movement in the early 70s, which we're still living through. Anyway, some of the predictions from. Forrester was fond of aphorisms, and one of his aphorisms was, all great places will be destroyed. Now, he didn't mean businesses. He meant that people would go to the best places and over-occupy them, and there'd be too many people. And we see that, of course, all around the world. Nicaragua, which once was a war zone, in my memory still is now full of $5 million homes on the beach from investors all over the world, because it's got great beaches, for example. But another way that can happen is through market forces. And I know we've all grown up in an era where market forces are extolled as the solution to everything, but they're not. And I think we all know that. Market forces can also make great places be destroyed. And one of the ways that happens, we're seeing in Concord right now, as what we call landlords, people who own buildings, which up until now have largely been old Concord families. You know, we know, I won't go through the names, but you know them. Many of our favorite shops and stores and print shops and other businesses have been owned by local families. It's not local families now that are buying in. I'm going to use this one as an example because we've already lost control over it, and I'm not advocating for anything to do with the Cafe Nero controversy. But the purchaser of the building where that business is probably going to go in, I don't really know, but again, I'm not making that argument, is called a landlord in some of the documentation. But it's actually an investment group that has on their website anywhere from 60 to 97 properties, depending on which page you look at. They aggregate capital, they call it institutional capital, and that capital looks for a great return by investing in New England town centers, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, particularly within Route 128. What does that mean, institutional capital? Well, it means that the capital is competed for by the business, and they have to compete with all the other possible places that one can invest capital. Mutual funds, hedge funds, franchises. You know, there are thousands of places where capital can be invested, but it's not going to be invested in the lower returns. It always looks for the higher return. We do too when we choose investments for ourselves. So that creates a really relentless drive for increasing profits and rents, because of course rents is the way that a real estate investment group makes their profits, and valuations. And it accelerates the transformation of town centers into what? Formula business centers. My term is like an airport. You know, if you go to some of the adjacent towns in towards Boston and you go to the centers, you don't find independent businesses. You find Chipotle, you find the Gap, you find basically the same stores you find at Logan, because those are the companies which are big enough to have the market power to extract enough money to justify their investment in high rent neighborhoods. And we, of course, are a high rent neighborhood. So I don't want to go on and on about that in particular, but of course, rising rents and valuations are just what one looks for if they're looking to invest in a town center. But it's not the good old landlords that we think about. These are really algorithms at work, in a sense. Formulas, not in the sense of formula business, but they're formulas for increasing what you get from the town. And to one degree or another, companies can be nicer or less nice, but they always need to get the top returns. So the only way to restrain this, I really want to speak strongly against the idea that sort of gentle persuasion through taxes and stuff like that can protect us. Caps work. Just like if you can't have water bottles, you don't have water bottles. It's a simple thing. And we really need that bylaw with the caps. It's worked in West Concord. It has not suppressed business. It can work in Concord Center. But if we don't have caps, we're going to have this competitive spiral of ever-increasing extraction of capital from Concord. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karen Curry, 247 Wellsbrook Road. I just wanted to make a quick comment that in West Concord there is this cap, but the cap is 10 and there are only 7 in West Concord currently. So it might work to the fact that if somebody wants to go where there's going to be a lot of formula businesses, like a strip mall, it might work against someone actually bringing their business into West Concord because they want to have more of them around them. But currently there still is room for more formula businesses in West Concord. So if anyone who's going to be working on it in the future, you would want to keep that number extremely low for the people who are on that side of the coin.
Thank you.
Joanna Gibson, 88 Walden Street. Can you hear me? I'm going to get off of formula businesses. Although I have one thing to say about that, is that you also should think about types of businesses, because places like Lexington have, many too many real estate firms and that type of thing. So that should be part of this. I know it's going to be the planning board who will be doing it, but if you do make a comment or have anything. What I'm concerned about is that in the zoning ideas, there's a lot of talk about making the centers of town very dense and having, you can't hear me? My husband can't hear me. Well, he never can hear me, but anyway.
You're good to go.
And everybody else okay?
Yeah.
I mean, when you talk about infill housing, the idea of it in Zone C is rather horrifying, because when you've got 10,000 square foot lots, that could be a problem. Because not only would you have a house, but you would also have a new driveway, etc. So I'm hoping that a priority we put on keeping green spaces in the centers of towns also. And I'm going to just read one sentence, which is section 4.1 under goal 3, the second paragraph, the last sentence says, further protecting Concord's open lands may result in the degradation of the build-up areas of town where infill housing, more accessory dwellings, or other changes to the zoning code may negatively impact historic character, context and character. So please keep that in mind.
Hello, my name is Bill Montague. Can you hear me all right? I've been a retailer in Concord for 41 years on Walnut Street.
You have to get right there.
And I'd like to make a simple long-range plan suggestion. I'll give this a copy I can give you later on.
Mr. Montague, would you speak directly into the microphone, please?
Okay.
There you go. Thank you.
Get close.
Just get close.
I would like to suggest we build a parking garage in Keyes Road parking just for employees only, and for the employees in the center only, leaving lots of room for the retail customers to park in Concord Center. Have it bridge Keyes Road and make the opening at least 40 feet wide. This would allow tourist buses to park under the under cover. There'd be restrooms on either side and probably a visitor center, but make it a tourist-friendly town. Tourists spend a lot of money. I've heard from the tourist people that came out, we had a meeting with them, that the average tourist spends $35 a piece when he comes to a town. And we get 1 million tourists to the North Bridge every year. Now, they don't spend any money, they just leave. But there is plans to have a tourist bus stop in Keyes Road now. So 2 places for tourist buses. Now, that doesn't cost us any money because they don't take up any parking spaces. They come by a bus. And if each one goes out and spends $35, that'll do a great deal to support the Concord Center businesses. So the tourist buses would be a really great thing to do. And make it a tourist-friendly town, and have a visitor center there under this cover. And I know it's a large, expensive thing to do, but other people have talked about it. I'm not the first one to talk about building a parking garage on Keyes Road lot, but that would be my suggestion.
Thank you.
I'll give a couple of these papers if you'd like.
Thank you very much.
I noticed 3 of the people on the left are left-handed.
Wow. What did you think about our group?
I don't know. Probably means something. Anyway.
Thank you very much.
Charles Phillips, 65 Fairhaven Road. Garrett Whitney's comments earlier led me to this kind of more philosophical question, I guess, that the committee needs to keep in mind. Just how much control does the town, official town, have, and schools have control of the future of the town over the next 15 years? Because there are enormous pressures coming from the expansion of business in the entire Boston area. We are part of the metropolitan area that seems to be growing, and an enormous number of private business decisions are being made all the time concerning what goes on in Concord. So I guess it's sort of something to keep in mind. I mean, I don't know if I think it knows the answer to that, but it's something to keep in mind for the committee to say, can we interact with these private efforts? Can we respond to them? Can we simply realize the limits of town government when we are embedded in a large metropolitan area with enormous economic forces?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sharon McGregor, 70 Williams Road. And just a quick story, preface my comments. I have a question and a comment. About 25, 30 years ago, I was, can you hear me?
Close to the mic.
Very close.
Thank you.
About 25, 30 years ago, I was standing before the Conservation Commission in my hometown in Central Mass, and I was part of a group that was advocating for greater wetlands protection and open space protection in our community. So we went through our long list of lands that we wanted to protect and what kinds of improvements we wanted to see in the administration of the Wetlands Act. And when I finished my presentation, the chair of the Conservation Commission said, "I must tell you that we are not Concord, Massachusetts." So that is an important point to highlight, that Concord is well ahead of the game on open space, natural resource protection. And I certainly applaud everything that Concord's done to date, and I'm now a proud resident of this town. And you're engaging in a very important process, and as well as we're doing, we can still do a little better. And there's much work to be done, and I wanted to just make a few comments along those lines. In section 4.6, the plan elements, open space, natural resources, I would like to see if you could consider putting that up front as the #1 goal. And the reason is because protecting our open space and natural resources really is the foundation for everything else. If we want to achieve good quality of life in our community, if we want to protect ensure economic sustainability and so forth, really natural resource health and protection is the foundation of that. So I would like to make the argument that it should be upfront first and foremost, and we only have a short window of time to protect what remaining open space we want to protect in Concord before it's gone. So we need to do an assessment and prioritize what we want to protect and realistically identify how we're going to pay for that protection, whether it's outright purchase or less than fee protection. So just for consideration to put that up front. And #2 under that section 4.6, pursue public education efforts to ensure all Concord residents understand the value of conservation lands and natural resources. If you could add not just the value, but the ecosystem function of our natural resources. And that really requires some education, some teaching about what that means. Ecosystem functions include things that are very, very important to our quality of life and survival in Concord, and they include pollution control, storm damage prevention, flood prevention, drought prevention, wildlife habitat, pollinator support, groundwater recharge, water supply, quality and quantity. All of those are key to our quality of life. So if you could consider adding that. And so the question that we need to ask ourselves is, are our natural resources working for us? Working in the sense of, are they providing the ecosystem services that they need to provide? And that's going to involve restoration, which I know the Resilience Committee is going to be addressing. So that's great. And under Goal 3, that's fantastic. You've mentioned the keywords ecosystem health and biodiversity. If you could add after management and restoration, because as I mentioned, we do have to do some restoring of soil health and other things to enable the natural resources to provide the services that they are capable of providing. And fiscal lens, it was mentioned that that should be the lens through which we look through everything, and I want to argue that it's really ecosystem services and environmental health that should be the lens, and then the fiscal issues can fall in after that, and we can better address those once we've dealt with the environmental and the environmental health and ecosystem services. And lastly, on the agricultural piece that you mentioned, you talk about protecting and promoting local agricultural activities, land, and traditions. And if you could add to that promoting regenerative practices in Concord, not just organic farming, but regeneration of the soils that makes our food supplies healthier and sustainable, increases crop yield, and it's a healthier food source, and much more sustainable. And I'll close with cautioning against the tyranny of small decisions. It would be so easy to make our decisions in isolation, but we know that we have to think of them collectively and how they impact on one another. So let's try in this planning process to make sure that we don't make that mistake of making small decisions in isolation that ultimately turn out to be potentially a wrong decision. And that's the systems thinking that Garrett talked about. And I encourage the committee and all of us participating in this process to remember that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lori Gilpazaris, Old Marlborough Road. I want to thank Sharon for her comments. They're certainly in keeping with Article 23. The final outcome of Article 23 remains to be seen, but I have a question regarding growth in the town, because I think as a community we've voiced our desire to maintain our open space and rural character as much as possible, and also to engage with a slow or low growth model. So I'm wondering where that sits in this plan, how it's being represented, and what the overall goals for kind of maintaining a slow, steady growth rate as opposed to just rapid expansion. Thank you.
I mean, actually, I would offer up just the suggestion that, that sits in an area that Charles Phillips raised. Certain demographic trends that are happening are beyond our control. So the growth in our town is not necessarily something we or any municipal body control. We can control some of the factors that have an impact on that growth, like the available housing or the tax base. These things have an impact on how we grow. So we've been trying to focus more on the things that are within our control, while understanding, to Charles' point, that there are factors and forces beyond our control. But I want to come back to what Sharon said, because I think she provided a really great statement there. As well as we're doing, we can do better. And so I think when we look at the growth that may or may not come to Concord, that we don't necessarily control, but we look at the factors that may have an impact on that growth, we can do better. And that's where I think, the role of regulation or incentives, private, initiatives, all of these things will have an impact. And I think that's the way that this board and the plan is trying to shape how the town develops over the future, whether it's growth or non-growth, or preserving historic assets and resources, preserving conservation land, open space. We're just trying to do what we've been doing very well, but do it a little better.
Bob Andrews again. On the open spaces and natural resources. On the open spaces and natural resources part of the plan. It talks, as in the, I think the first goal, as it does in some of the other goals, about maintaining. Maintaining to me is a somewhat vague kind of word. It doesn't necessarily excite one, to talk about maintaining. I would hope that what you really have in mind is that you want to protect, preserve, and restore, open spaces currently owned by the town. It needs to be clear that encroachment on those spaces by new development is really off the chart. Resilience concepts also call for selective restoration of lands that may be losing valued natural resources or ecosystems due to previous encroachments. Well, I think you've got that sort of in another goal there, but definitely include, I think, increasing open spaces when opportunities arise to acquire now privately owned land that is rich with natural resources, which may or may not be adjacent. Maybe that comes under next month, but I think it's, it's important to think about. If there is land and it's rich with natural resources, can you add it, to what we've got? On the education, I think education is great, and that's a great goal to have in there. Again, maybe for next month, I wonder about how you approach, doing that, actually doing that education. Is it going to depend on the existing Natural Resources Commission, which has a lot of things that it has to do? Does it have the current, staffing and funding to do education, or would you put it under adult education? I hope that you will, find some way to make it really happen and not just be something that maybe somebody will do as a sideline with all the other things they have to do.
Diane Proctor, 57 Sudbury Road. Thank you for the enormous hard work that this committee has done and for the thoughtfulness. But I have noticed, but it's not as a too bad, but I have noticed an emphasis on reducing traffic, at the same time increasing this community and enhancing its historic values. And in some very interesting ways, those can be contradictory. And you've all been talking about contradictory forces and how you balance them. Those can become contradictory issues. Jay Forrester was interestingly brought up by Garrett Whitney, an old mentor of mine. And he used to talk about counterintuitive behavior. And one of the things he spoke about reminds me of our parking situation in town. We put in parking meters in the hopes that we would move people along. Instead, we find that hasn't always worked in the way that we imagined it might work. A kind of counterintuitive behavior has occurred. In not a dissimilar way, we were just in Quebec City for 4 days, where there are vast parts of that city where you're not allowed to drive any cars. Whether it's a Bill's parking garage or whatever, those spaces, there were no parking spaces. It was unbelievable how crowded, how active, how viable those streets were, how that would reduce traffic, and what that kind of does to a town center. So when we think about parking, maybe we should also think about parking not. Thinking about the different ways in which we could organize our centers to reduce some of the pressures and tensions that so many of us have been feeling. And so, having said that, my question is, if the planning board is now responsible for addressing this very interesting concern about formula businesses, and I hope their next meetings will be packed with people, in fact, many of their meetings will be packed with people, whose responsibility is it to make these, to engage in this discussion about parking and the way we use our town center in terms of this traffic, bringing historic energy to the town, and those perhaps conflicting concerns?
Yes, one of the areas we have identified since publishing the draft is that the town, we're going to recommend that the town have a traffic or a traffic mobility function. And that really includes parking and everything else. It's a very complex system. I studied it for the committee a bit this year, and it turns out that most of our intuitions about what to do to make traffic better are actually likely to make traffic worse. And anyway, that's enough said for now, but it has become a focus since we published the draft, and it will be acknowledged as a very important thing for the town. We don't have a unified traffic mobility function or focus right now, and we need one.
But if you look at the list that's on the handout outside, Those goals have been revised, and what he's talking about is already reflected.
I saw that, Gary, and that's what actually that's what promoted my question. Who? I mean, who brings the study to bear? How transparent will it be? How open will it be? I mean, who will know what's going on? Is this the town manager's responsibility?
That's what May is about. Now we've set the goals. Now we're going to be looking at specific actions and accountable implementation. So who would be tasked with seeing this goal through, and what budget resources would be tapped or identified for allowing that entity to...
Thank you so much.
We've been very careful not to specify exactly how this should be done.
Right. To your point earlier, our job is to say what should happen, not how.
Hi, Brian Folds, 33 Riverdale.
Close to the mic.
You really got to get close.
You need to
You really can't hear me?
No. You got to put your mouth right into it.
Oh my God, I got to eat this thing.
You gotta get it right there.
I just wanted to emphasize.
What's your name again, please?
Brian Folds, 33
Brian,
Riverdale.
As if it's an ice cream cone and you're going to eat it.
All right. I'm not good at this. But I just wanted to emphasize, you mentioned that you wanted to focus on mobility and do a study, and we talked about parking meters and parking spaces and traffic flow. But a big component of that in mobility is about pedestrian ways, about bicycles, about deciding whether on a road should be a pedestrian way or a road, or should it be one lane or should it be 3 lanes. I want to make sure that the scope of that idea is broader than I heard just a moment ago. Thank you.
I'd encourage you to look at goal number 2 and goal number 3 under the traffic mobility section.
Hi, Joan Entwistle, 53 Staffordshire Lane. Am I loud enough? Okay. Brian just said one of the things that I really wanted to see added to the plan. I found a couple of comments in the draft that were kind of disturbing to me, to the effect of, we don't know if they'll actually use these bike paths or sidewalks, and I think that highlights the need that we need to have basically a comprehensive bicycle and walking plan, and we need that right away. And we also need to start looking at things like when we do commercial buildings, office parks, why are there no trails? I'm looking at my little neighborhood where, it looks certainly like there's lots of open space near it, but it's all private. There's no trails or paths. I have to walk on Route 62 to get to the nearest park, and so that kind of defeats the goal of, being 10 minutes from any green space or open space, which is the goal that we should be going for with connecting our trails and our sidewalks. Another thing is we have a lot of elderly people in my community, and we're less than half a mile from Emerson Hospital, but we can't walk to Emerson Hospital because there isn't a sidewalk up several of the key roads that we could be using to get there. So people have to drive. Or drive to their appointments, their physical therapy, whatever. So I would just like to see that included. I know it was suggested at one of the meetings that I went to have this comprehensive bicycle and I'm not sure the exact title of it, but basically bicycle walking that would work on making sure that when you're evaluating a complete street that it fits in with and connects paths and these things. And right now the goal is kind of a watered down, identify a few good projects to do here and there, but that doesn't address the, I think we really need to be looking very closely at the needs of people in these dense, quote unquote, walkable, but really not so walkable neighborhoods that we have, especially around West Concord. So I'd like to just also say that in your zoning, it does seem like you say adopt zoning that recognizes the value of landscapes and protect unique features, a few little explore zoning alternatives, based on land characteristics rather than strictly geographic location, which I think is an excellent idea. But it just says to enable higher density mixed use, more walkable. But I think we need to make sure that we're including in our village centers open space and green spaces, which, at least in my neighborhood, I think there's a shortage of. Everywhere else in town, everybody has wonderful, large, tracks of trails that they can walk down the street to get to, but not in all neighborhoods. And especially if we're considering, trying to have more mixed-use housing in these neighborhoods, I think it's kind of discriminatory that all the open space is everywhere else. I'm sorry, my thoughts are rather disjointed because the new goals just came out, so I'm trying to incorporate those into my thoughts. I think that about says it. Thank you very much. This is a great plan, otherwise.
Thank you.
Hi, Garrett Whitney again. A quick one. I think I want to ask you, I read the plan again. Not working? All the way in, okay. So I read the plan again last night, and I think under the economic vitality section, one of the values, under the goals piece, one of the values or goals was growth. Is that still correct? Is that in there, that language? If it isn't, I won't make this comment. But anyway, if it is in there, and I think it was, I don't think that's a value we should put in as our goal. It may be a good thing in certain cases. I'm not anti in all ways. For example, we might want more affordable housing. We might want all sorts of things more. But for Concord in general, I don't think growth is a great goal to put front and center. It may be a means. It may be a consequence.
Would you say that the goal should be to shrink?
No, not at all. I'm just saying as my favorite economist, Kate Rayworth, if you know her, says, I'm an agnostic with this. It should be dependent upon the other values that we have, not be a value in itself. And there are places, of course, where growth is a great thing. And
so we've had many conversations about growth, pros
I'm sure.
and cons, and how to address growth. And in June, you'll see what we decided, the conclusion of it. But I think that fundamentally it's a very important issue. And I would say that one of the comments that has been repeatedly made in our committee meetings is that we've just built 4 new schools, and perhaps there's a middle school still to come. But those schools have a certain capacity. And so if we were to argue for increasing growth that might grow us out of those new schools, that might be an unintended consequence. So I think that there's how we address growth will be very, very important. But there were many economists who would tell you that if you're not growing, you're dying. And so
even Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
Anyway, my recommendation is take that out as a value. Use it when necessary. Don't resist it, but don't go for it either. Thanks.
Pam Rockwell, 1810 Main Street. Can you hear me?
No.
Okay. Okay, Pam Rockwell, 1810 Main Street?
Yep.
Okay. I wanted to point out I appreciated Ms. McGregor's thoughts on the environment, that we needed to consider the ecosystem services that are provided by our natural resources, and we need to make sure that our natural resources are working for us. And she specifically mentioned recharge, and I want to point out that water is a really important thing in Concord. It's a limiting factor in how big a building you can build, how many lots you can build, what you can do. And your sort of one point of zoning that might have to do with that would be to adapt zoning that recognizes the value of landscape. And I think you need to be a little more specific about that. A lot of the open space is not just zoned for open space. It's the space in people's backyards. It's the space between houses. It's the space between the sidewalk and the road. And we need the water to get back into the aquifers underneath. as people are reducing things like the water use for watering their lawns with town water, and businesses are putting in wells that are sucking up water from underneath to do their own irrigation, we're going to be sharing this water more and more and more, and I think that that's a value that really needs to be in there. It's not just a matter of landscape, like we want it to be a little less grass. It's more like we need the landscape to work for us. We need to be sure that we're putting recharge areas where they need to be so that we actually have the water when we need it. We do have a whole service area for the town infrastructure that's on water supply, and it doesn't really talk about identifying recharge areas, being prepared for droughts, being prepared. Nagog Pond is not our only source of water in the town. We have to put the water back where we find it in order to actually have it to use. Every time we're doing irrigation, or doing drainage for things, we should be thinking about rain gardens, things that look better than just a drainage ditch. Anything that we can do in the zoning to promote recharge, I think, would be a really valuable addition to our plan. And it's very hard because our water resource, again, is considered the town infrastructure, but maybe it could be called out a little more with housing, in with open space, and with zoning. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, look under section 4.7, goal 5, where we do talk about infrastructure. And we do talk a little bit about making landscape resilience a central planning priority for the town. And there are some water suggestions there. But you're right, there needs to be more mention of water in the land use section, zoning section as well, and other.
And really thinking of it as a resource that we really need to keep control of. It's as important as the electricity. It's as important as the other resources we have. So.
Thank you. Lori Gilpazaris, Old Marlborough Road. Jerry, I asked you this question before the meeting. A new goal has appeared, and I felt somewhat concerned about it because I wondered if it highlighted some tensions that have been going on in town, and it has to do with the goal under miscellaneous. It's reduced the volunteer commitment to the town. And I know you explained that in terms of the fact that we have too many committees. We have 66, and I thoroughly agree that that's way too many for any town to try to tackle. And I agree with the goal of having a task force to look at all the committees and to see where they can be streamlined. But what concerns me is the language on reduce the volunteer commitment, because I don't think it's really the volunteer commitment that needs to be reduced. As a matter of fact, given the range of talents throughout the town, I would hope that the town would take advantage of those talents to reduce staffing needs, if anything, and the fiscal, and encourage fiscal responsibility, because I know there are a lot of people in town who, would love to volunteer and to share some of their expertise. And I know it's messy for the town to have to deal with all the what is the word I want, renegades or whatever. I think you get the gist of that. But I think that it's a healthier democratic process when it comes down to it, and that we come away with the best solutions to our problems. And by trying to kind of make things insular and have the same people, the town people, always on the committees, it's just not making a lot of sense to me, and I would encourage you to change that language to reduce committees and not to reduce volunteers or volunteerism.
Yeah, and I'll acknowledge that it's poorly worded. The intent was more to reduce the current burden of volunteer commitment. Right now, we have a hard time filling or staffing all of the committees that we have. So that was the intent. But
thank you.
Lisa Resnick, 45 Laurel Street. I'm curious about this small affordable house and to know if you've found any solutions for that. Because I know that what tends to happen is small houses that are existing tend to get torn down and replaced with larger homes. And I also was wondering if the idea of building like an old-fashioned duplex so that two homes sort of in the space of one would be considered a viable option. Thanks.
Can I have it? Yeah, sure.
I think what we've tried to say in the plan is that we need to look more broadly at diversifying the type of housing that Concord has, and that could include duplexes. It might include co-housing. It might include changes to zoning that would allow individuals to put an apartment within their own home or as part of their land. Again, they're not things that we as a committee can institute, but they certainly are suggestions that we can make so that the type of housing that's available within the town is broadened. We don't have a specific solution on keeping small houses. If you do, we'd be glad to hear it. We've had a lot of discussion about it. It's probably the most commonly made comment on the website. Why do we let people take down small houses? Basically what people say. So we're trying to find a solution because everyone agrees we'd like to keep a diversity of housing style.
The Council on Aging Board just sent a set of recommendations to the committee to address the needs of people who want to age in their own homes. And one of those was to make it easier for people to create subdivisions without changing the external character of their homes, to allow for more families to share, for more entry-level families to come into town, and also to make it more affordable and feasible for seniors to remain in their homes if they choose to do that.
Good evening. My name is Ned Perry, 362 Bedford Street. I appeared at one of your early meetings and tried to get the libraries better represented in your report, and I would ask you to continue to think about that because the libraries are a very important part of our community. Another important part of our community is the medical world, and particularly Emerson Hospital, I believe, is the biggest employer in town. I had a friend on the 2005 Long Range Planning Committee, and she got built into the Long Range Plan in 2005. The 2020 vision, a medical corridor. It's very, very faintly in that plan. I appeared tonight, and hopefully early enough, so that you might give some consideration to thinking about a medical corridor along Route 2, and perhaps even talking with Acton and trying to get some communications going back and forth with Acton. We're presently having a little difficulty with Acton. But I don't think it would be bad to start trying to have better relationships with some of our neighboring towns. And maybe a medical corridor could stretch beyond. I think we've done a very good job with the extension of Baker Ave, and the medical world continues to grow in Concord. But as I get closer to those medical needs, 13 years from the last time I presented to the last committee, I'm very much aware of those needs for all of our citizens. With Dr. Lenhart on the committee, I hope you'll not only talk to her and listen to her on housing, but also talk to her about the medical needs of the medical community. And I invite you to think perhaps some futuristic ideas about a medical corridor being continued to expand on Route 2. Thank you.
sorry, what is your name now?
Oh, Sharon McGregor, 70 Williams Road.
I'll just repeat the question, and maybe Judy can field it, but Sharon McGregor, Williams Road, raised the question, what's the distinction between open space versus natural resources? Because we have separate goals now for each of those, and maybe Peter and Judy can separately address that.
As we have separate goals, because as we look at, especially in the Natural Resources Commission, certainly the land, which is the stuff, you know, the acreage everybody sees, is very important. But the natural resources is not only that open space, but also what is on that open space, and quite frankly, on a lot of people's private properties too. You can, thank you. So it's things like our wetlands, it's the ecosystems, all the way from the bugs and the salamanders up to the birds, et cetera, that are the natural resources, the habitats that they need to have to be thriving. So there's the wildlife, there's the habitats, there's protection of our water supplies, and all the other things that many people have talked about. So the natural resources are more the characteristics and beyond just the acreage itself. One can have open space, but it may be highly manicured lawns, which is not protecting the natural resources. So we were attempting to go more broadly on natural resources to beyond just the physical land that many people think of when they think about it.
Yeah, I just echo what Judy said, and of course open spaces also for the benefit of the citizens, for recreation and walking trails and the like, and try to emphasize the benefits of utilizing that space, and the comments that were made about connecting those trails are valid and something that's part of our plan.
Yeah, I mean, thank you all very much for coming. If there are other comments, obviously, you can always go to envisionconcord.org, our website for this project, and enter additional comments. You can also send an email to, I think it's comprehensive plan. Or what's it? Wait. Envision Concord at concordma.gov. We have a website off the planning department's webpage. So continue to reach out, come to our meetings at the second and fourth Friday, 8 to 9:30 at Kais Road. And thank you for your comments, and hopefully you'll enjoy the resulting plan. For the draft plan, the deadline for public comments is Friday, the 27th, and then we will be issuing, as we indicated, a final plan in early June for a short public comment period as well.
I think you should say, though, that we're open for business, so we continue to,
Comments that come in will all be considered.
Yeah.
And we'll be doing our best to try and align what every individual says relative to the collective wisdom of this committee and all of the other residents and boards and committees that have commented to us.
Thank you for doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you.